The little leather baby shoe sat on the dining table like an accusation. Nora found it there on the morning the world decided she was no longer entitled to privacy. It was alone among spotless plates and half-empty champagne flutes from the celebration that had become a funeral for everything she thought stable. 8 months into a pregnancy she'd planned for, protected, whispered to even in the small hours, 8 months into carrying a future she had already started naming, she watched the shoe and felt, for a terrible lucid second, like the last person in a house full of strangers. He had not left quietly. Marcus Hale had left with the kind of theatrical cruelty that seemed designed for headlines. A statement, a photograph on social media, a press release drafted in the voice of the family spokesman and polished to a chill shine. In the post, Marcus smiled beside another woman, hand possessively at her waist, the caption as smooth as a knife. Starting a new chapter. The comments were a bloodbath. Friends chose sides like families at a chessboard. Brands and donors called their assistants, and within 48 hours, the room Nora had thought was sanctuary felt like a stage where every spectator held a scorecard. Nora slid the shoe into a drawer and breathed slowly so the baby would not stir. The hospital bag was packed in the closet, soft onesies folded into a small tower, an ultrasound picture taped to the inside lid. For days she'd kept arranging and rearranging items as if placement could alter fate. Now she told herself practical things. Call the midwife, answer the lawyer's short text about temporary orders, tell the nanny that payments would continue. But these tasks were scaffolding over a hollow that had nothing to do with logistics. This betrayal was not only about Marcus leaving. It was about the publicness of it, about being erased in a single curated image. When Marcus announced his new life, he did so with the confidence of someone who believed his public image could be controlled the way one arranges flowers. Strategically, symmetrically, and without bruises. His words to the assembled reporters at the country club's terrace came out like rehearsed absolutes. He spoke of authenticity, of following one's truth. No apology, no hint of the million quiet compromises that had kept their marriage together for a decade. No acknowledgement of the child he was abandoning before it had even learned to breathe. Nora did not watch the press conference live. Instead, she watched later, had to, because someone, some relative or a neighbor who wanted to be the first to tell her, had recorded it and texted it to her at 2 in the morning when sleep was most elusive. Marcus looked at ease on video. The other woman, Elena Voss, glowed beside him like a patron saint in a magazine layout. Later, Nora learned that Marcus had introduced Elena as my partner in a private group chat before his public announcement. That night, the group chat had turned into a desert of messages about shared investments, weekend plans, and the new house they would set up for their little family. What cut him down for Nora was not only the leaving, it was the precision. To leave when she was 8 months pregnant, to stage a new life so quickly that all the people who should have been standing with her were instead retweeting images of some woman who, for the cameras, looked impossibly untroubled. The constitutional ache that followed was a different thing entirely from anger. It was quieter and fiercely practical. Nora called Lena her only sister because Lena was the kind of person who turned fractures into plans. Lena arrived with takeout and a pile of legal pamphlets, her own fury a bright, functional blade. "We'll get a temporary custody order before the next ultrasound," Lena said, her voice flat where Nora's was frayed. "You don't need to talk to anyone you don't want to. I'm reporting the account that posted the photo. You wipe the memory of that feed. You block him. I will handle the press until the baby is born." "It felt like he wanted me to be ashamed," Nora said later, folding and refolding a tiny sweater, as though the motion could smooth the burr of shame. "He wants you to disappear into the story he told the world," Lena answered. "We won't let that happen." Outside, the neighborhood hummed on. The Hales, a name that had once been a stamp of local prestige, suddenly found themselves a subject of gossip threads and late-night punditry. Marcus's father, Richard Hale, sent a terse message through a private counsel. Protect the family brand. Richard's messages were precise, small-order instructions meant to steer action without sentiment. In the days following the announcement, the Hale home became a small war room where reputation management was discussed in the same tone parents used to pick schools for children. Calmly, authoritatively, with decisions arrived at by committee. Elena, the woman in the photographs, was thin in person and in photographs. She had an air of being assembled from parts that had once been elegant and now were calculatingly elegant. She was also, Nora discovered, under the care of a doctor at the downtown clinic, Dr. Adrian Keene. The name came up because Elena had been seen arriving at the clinic unprompted in the first week after the scandal broke, on a day when the tabloids wanted fresh images for their front pages. Elena's visits to Dr. Keene were unremarked by the tabloid cameras until someone noticed him in the background of a photograph, his white coat an inadvertent signpost. Dr. Keene was not the kind of person who appeared on the gossip pages. He was an associate at a well-regarded women's health practice, quiet, methodical, a man who had earned a reputation among staff for meticulous notes and an unwillingness to bend rules. He had a history of being exacting about records and a low tolerance for cheeriness when patients were in crisis. Eleanor arrived at his office with the kind of composure that masks everything. Where the press saw a woman lit for magazines, in the soft light of the clinic she seemed at times almost smaller. It was in that office that the first thread began to pull loose. Dr. Keene was initially interested in Elena's case for entirely professional reasons. She complained of persistent headaches and a mouthful of inconsistent narratives about a previous surgery that, according to her paperwork, had taken place in 2 different hospitals under 2 different names. Paperwork errors, he thought as a clinician, clerical mistakes, misfiled charts. Mistakes happen, he told himself, and set about correcting a single line of the table, patient identity verification. But a physician's curiosity is not always satisfied by administrative fixes. He found a discrepancy in the file history that felt wrong, not because of one date or one signature, but because the edits formed a pattern. A clinical note with a timestamp 3 hours before a scanned receipt for a procedure. A hospital authorization that bore a colleague's initials but a medical record number belonging to a different department. He saw that the nurse who had uploaded the discharge note had listed a pausing cadence in her narrative, a hesitation reflected in metadata only visible to records managers, where the data said she had filled in details in a rush. Dr. Keene made the inquiry the way doctors do when the compass needle has shifted, quietly to the records clerk, then to the IT administrator, then to a supervisor. When he asked for the original scanned documents, he was given a file with a note that said the originals had been archived and reconstructed. That word, reconstructed, sat in his mouth like a taste of iron. The clinic's archive room was a low-ceilinged space with locked cabinets. Protocol required formal requests routed through legal. Dr. Keene did not take that route immediately. He was curious, not yet convinced that any wrongdoing had taken place. But curiosity in his line of work is the first step toward everything. He made small, careful moves, an extra request for logs, a question posed in a meeting, a private message to a systems analyst, until he had access to a portion of the file history that was not meant for physicians to peruse. Raw metadata. The timestamps showed edits that were not only inconsistent, they carried the same user ID across different hospital systems. The same username, it turned out, was associated with an account that had once been mapped to a company name recognized by anyone who skimmed business filings, Hale Solutions. When a name like that appears in an unexpected place, it prickles. By then, the scandal had made the Hales more than a family. They were a brand. It was plausible, even unsurprising, to find their money behind quiet corrections. But plausible is not proof, and a good doctor knows the difference. He asked for a printout of the logs and took it home like a man taking home a book that will keep him up at night. Eleanor, for her part, kept her secrets the way a person keeps a second skin, close and in place until the pressure in the room made it chafe. She had come to Dr. Keene as a patient, but there were moments when she spoke to him as if he were a harbor. "Everyone thinks I made my choices for a man," she said once, when she thought the office empty, but the building through the thin walls hummed with admin voices. "They don't understand. Sometimes it's survival." Dr. Keene listened in the pause between clinical questions and the reflex to diagnose. He is not a saint. He is a man who has watched birth and loss with the same steady hands for years. He knows intimacy and pain in ways many people do not. The divide between doctor and patient in his office began to narrow because, when Elena cried quietly in his examination chair about a public life that had sanded her edges, he answered with something like understanding. Small gestures become data points in a different ledger. A text to check on a late-night migraine, a coffee missed at a clinic meeting but with a handwritten note left for the nurse praising the new anesthetist. There was nothing illicit in kindness. Boundaries were not broken by a single act, but lines blur in the company of pain and the human instinct to help. What Dr. Keene thought would be a clinical curiosity became something more personal, a tether. He found himself cataloguing Elena's laughs in his mind like constellations, noticing the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she lied about being more resilient than she felt. He began to feel protective in ways professional oaths did not cover. At the hospital archive, the trace of Hale solutions in patient logs should have been the end of it for a principled clinician. It should have been a reason to alert legal and let the institutional machinery respond. Instead, Dr. Keene held the printouts in his hands and remembered a face watchful in a photograph. Marcus, the man who had walked out on a woman 8 months pregnant while hugging a new life into public view. He thought of the little shoe Nora had left on her table. He thought of hunger, and how it sometimes showed not as appetite, but as a series of choices people justify later with the language of necessity. Curiosity became leverage when he cross-referenced payment information. Hale Solutions had, on paper, been a consulting arm. Payments appeared to vendors in short bursts. One of those vendors was a company that managed third-party digital archives for clinics and private practices. Companies that handle scanning, storage, and sometimes the reconstitution of files for litigation. The money trail was not direct. It never is. It ran through middlemen, through shell invoices, and through a consultant whose veneer of respectability would hold up under casual scrutiny. But when Dr. Keene asked quietly, the consultant's email was a link, a forwarding address. The consultant did not return his first message. He returned the second time with a short note that said, "Legal will review," and a line that read like a threat. "This is above your pay grade." He should have turned the evidence over to the clinic's compliance officer then. Instead, he did what sometimes happens when someone believes there is both a wrongdoing and a wronged person. He asked Elena directly whether she had been promised anything, whether anyone had ever asked her to recreate records, whether she had ever wondered why her file bore different names. Elena refused at first. Her mouth made a careful small denial, and then she told him she had trusted Marcus. She had believed in the power of his voice and the quiet authority his name opened for her. "I never asked for anything," she said, "but I never told anyone I wouldn't accept help. I was weak and I wanted to be seen." Dr. Keene saw then how complex complicity could be. Not every secret is theft. Some are survival strategies bound up in shame. That didn't absolve anyone. It did not make the metadata legitimate. It made the person in front of him human. Nora lived in a different orbit from the clinic's technical records. Her life was a tangle of doctor's appointments, prenatal checking in with the midwife, twice weekly monitoring, calls to a specialist about a breech birth that might need gentle correction, and public strategy sessions where lawyers wrote requests for privacy in sentences that felt apologetic for their own impotence. The public's appetite for moral drama had not waned. If anything, it had sharpened. Marcus's side of the story implied liberation, reinvention. On the feeds, people picked adjectives like flowers. Brave, honest, authentic. They withheld empathy from the pregnant woman who, some of them wrote, should have seen it coming. The internet's verdicts are always fast and mean. One afternoon, Nora went to a routine appointment and sat under soft fluorescent lights that made the ultrasound machine look like a small altar. Her midwife, a woman named Priya with gray-flecked hair and patient eyes, had become a guardian in the small acts of prenatal care. She had learned the patterns of Nora's breathing, where she kept her hands when she felt nervous, how she said the baby's name out loud on odd, tender evenings. Priya ran the wand across Nora's belly with an ease born of familiarity and the small miracle of repetition. On the monitor, a round head, a flicker of spine, a tiny kicking motion that Nora thought of as the baby's stubbornness. "Strong heart rate," Priya reported, her voice professional but soft. "Everything looks good for now." Nora let herself exhale. The relief was not unblemished. It was threaded with the pragmatic knowledge that the coming weeks could be complicated. She left the clinic with fingers curled around the latest printed image and a determination like armor. She would not let the public narrative strip her of authority over the one body she knew intimately. As the scandal played out in public, Marcus doubled down on appearances. He bought a new apartment with Elena, staged dinners with philanthropists who took flattering photos, and set up interviews where he spoke of reinvention in a tone that made it sound like a moral triumph. Richard Hale, his father, arranged for a damage control strategy that included discreet settlements, the hush of certain employees, and once, a call to an old friend in the finance industry who could quiet an uncomfortable contractor. Those calls were invisible threads that tugged at other lives. A nurse who had once hesitated before admitting a mislabeled chart received a call about career recalibration. A junior records manager found his contract suddenly terminating with vague language about redundancy. The more the Hales applied pressure, the more friction created sparks. Someone in social media dug up a photograph from a decade earlier. Marcus at a fundraiser, elbow to a man whose investments had once been questioned. Someone else posted a screenshot of a text message sent to a former employee that read crudely, "Make it disappear." It was the kind of thing people shared because it felt like authentic dirt in a world of polished lies. The press thrived on those scraps. In the clinic, the small discoveries stacked. Dr. Keene returned to the metadata with a more methodical eye. He found a voice memo embedded in a file that had gone unexamined, an audio clip converted to text during an internal audit, then filed away. It was marked facelessly as internal note, source unverified. The transcription software had done what it does, attempted clarity from acoustic muddle. Names were garbled in places, but one phrase cut through with crystalline unpleasantness. "We make sure she doesn't get suspicious. Pay the nurse, alter the timestamp." The voice was not obviously male or female on first listen. It carried the casual authority of someone used to delegating and not delegating accountability. Dr. Keene did not know who had recorded it or how it had made its way into the file. He sat at his kitchen table at midnight, the voice memo looping in a thin hush through his laptop's small speakers, and realized he was holding a document that could change a life. It spoke of intentional alteration, not clerical error. Records do not reconstruct themselves. Someone orders it, someone pays. The instinct to go to the clinic compliance officer was immediate. The instinct to talk to a detective was also immediate. But another instinct, more human and cumbersome, whispered a different path. He wanted to know what Elena would say, and whether she had been coerced or merely complicit. He wanted to understand the totality of the person who had been smiling in Marcus's posted photograph as if nothing had happened under the skin. So he called Elena and asked her to come in. When she arrived, she smelled faintly of perfume and something stronger, nervousness. She sat in his sterile office with the paper of a patient's vulnerability in her hands and listened as he explained the fragment of tape. Her face changed in a way that made him feel both pity and a sudden unfamiliar protectiveness. "I don't know how that got there," she said, and the sentence was a small, brittle thing. "I thought—" She stopped, searched for a phrase that would excuse herself, and found none. "Did you ever discuss anything like that?" Dr. Keene asked. Her answer, yes and no, was a familiar human sound. In it was admission of being used, but also of using. She confessed to being offered help. She confessed to agreeing to things when she felt there was no other path. She confessed finally that she had been frightened of poverty and of loss, and had made choices that were not heroics but a version of survival. She did not look away when she said it. She had the sort of gaze that, in another life, would have been described as honest because it refused flattery. The moral line for Dr. Keene shifted under his feet. A physician's job is to heal, to document, to do no harm. He was now considering harm that the system itself had enabled, the corruption of records, the buying of silence. The evidence in his hands suggested that someone with wealth and access had leveraged the architecture of medical administration for personal ends. He thought of Nora's baby shoe again, how small and insignificant it seemed against the machinery of a family's wealth. He asked to see the rest of Elena's records. She was hesitant, but when she said yes and signed the release, he felt a strange, invasive guilt, like a man reading someone else's diary. The file history showed things that could not be easily explained away. payments routed through intermediaries, email trails with subject lines that read adjustments and containment, timestamp anomalies that suggested the same hand-making edits across multiple documents. One invoice bore, faintly, the name of a firm used by the Hales for years. Every piece of data had to be vetted. He sent the email to compliance. He sent another to the hospital's IT department asking for a full audit. Rules required that he stop there. The law required it, the oath required it. But when compliance responded with a canned reply, "We will review and respond," and when the IT department acknowledged receipt but promised an extended timeline, Dr. Keen's patience, already attenuated by the moral clarity these facts forced upon him, snapped into something else. He did something a doctor with a conscience and a private grievance might do. He made copies for himself, not because he intended to use them for anything illicit, but because, in the quiet of the night, he imagined a scenario in which those files would be lost or altered again. He told himself this was only insurance. He told himself he would turn them over to authorities. He told himself that he would never betray confidentiality. The next morning, a new document appeared in Elena's public profile, a glossy magazine interview in which she spoke of love found and truth embraced. In it, she said all the things the camera wanted to hear, and the world cheered. The article was a surgical strike that reframed the narrative in her favor. The writer quoted Marcus calling their new life authentic, and the comments were ablaze with would-be philosophers offering takeaways about courage and honesty. Nora watched the article with hands clenched around the edges of a paper printout. She did not mean to read the interview at first, but news traveled in forms that felt less like news and more like weather, unavoidable and out of control. She read the way Elena smiled in the glossy image and wondered if perhaps there were bars she could not see, if perhaps choices were complicated by the pressure of being unmoored and young, and tempted by the illusion of rescue. She could imagine Elena in some small room at night, being asked to accept things to keep from starving. She could imagine her in other darker configurations. But none of those images removed the fact that Elena had willingly stepped into Marcus's life and into the spotlight. Marcus's response to all of this was to double down on the narrative of authenticity. When critics attacked him for cruelty, he posted an essay about living honestly and tagged it with images of architectural minimalism and existential quotes. When a local conservative commentator accused him of abandoning family values, Marcus arranged for a speaking engagement at a chamber event. He sought to manufacture moral credit as if it were currency. Meanwhile, his father's advisors moved quietly in the background, buying consulting hours from a PR firm and quietly nudging financial partners away from interviews. There were small signposts, however, that Marcus's control was not absolute. At a gala hosted by one of the city's prominent foundations, he stood beneath chandeliers and made a toast about second chances. The room applauded, the cameras loved him, but when he looked at Elena across the room, backlit, laughing with someone from a brand he had been courting, there was a flicker of something raw in his face. Fear, perhaps, or the first real realization of what he had given up. It was subtle, almost imperceptible in the moment, but to an attentive observer, it suggested the man who had once used other people as props might soon discover how quickly props could betray. Dr. Keen, carrying the printouts in a thin folder, attended the same gala under the excuse of a routine seat on a panel about maternal health. He felt conspicuous in a world that smelled like perfume and money and brands. He watched Marcus speak and saw the effect the man had on a room. Control threaded into his voice like a practiced cadence, and he felt an irritation grow that was less medical than personal. He thought of the voice memo again, and the sense that someone in that room might be implicated, and that such rooms foster a kind of mutual protection that insulated perpetrators from consequences. That night, late at the clinic, compliance called to say they had flagged anomalies in Elena's chart. The IT department said they would begin a formal audit that week. Dr. Keen listened and wrote down dates and names. He knew the forms that institutions use to shield themselves: review, investigation, no comment. He also knew the time those forms buy is often time enough for evidence to cool and for narratives to be reshaped. He could give the facts to compliance and step back, but he imagined the bright, fragile thing of Nora's unborn child and thought of what it means when the small have no platform to speak. And so curiosity, like a tide, kept returning to the shore until a single decisive proof revealed itself. It came not in a dramatic confession but in a ledger. An employee expense claim for a catered lunch, an innocuous thing, filed under a clinic administrator's name and paid by a holding company linked to the Hales. The trail was slender and forensically routine. Someone who knew how to hide money in plain sight smiles at the simplicity. But then there was the voice memo, careless, unsanitized, now transcribed more clearly by a better programmed doctor. Keene ran through the logs. The voice that instructed a subordinate to move the file and make it clean. The deal is done. And the name that followed? Nora. Hearing the name aloud in the cold light of the office, Dr. Keene felt a connection he could not deny. It was a thread that linked a public betrayal to a private act. Record manipulation that would make an inconvenient pregnancy appear, in certain contexts, to be evidence of something else. The meaning of such machinations ran dark and deep. If records could be adjusted, narratives could be sculpted, custody disputes could be shaped, the social weight of truth could be bent. For the first time, he felt fear, not for himself, but for the pregnant woman whose name appeared on that tape as an object to be moved. He could see the sequence. Nora erased from a paper trail, an alternate narrative placed in a file that would, in court or in public, undermine her claim. He imagined a future in which the minute things, an email, a timestamp, become the instruments that deprive a mother of rights. He printed the ledger and the transcript. He re-listened to the memo until the words no longer sounded like sound, but like evidence. He thought of the hospital board and their slow wheels and the way a family's money navigated ethically porous channels with ease. He thought of Marcus's voice during the press conference and the smoothness with which he had made a private decision feel like moral clarity. He thought of Elena's small, uneven confessions and of Nora sitting at home with a baby shoe like an accusation. He could hand everything to the compliance officer and wait for institutional response. He could file an anonymous tip to the investigator who handled hospital fraud. He could do nothing and sleep, perhaps, a little easier. Instead, he picked up the phone and called Detective Rios. Detective Rios had none of the energy of a man who imagined himself in the center of a melodrama. He was a practical, efficient person whose face was often blurred at the edges of newspaper photographs because he rarely allowed public access. He had a reputation for patience, a willingness to let facts accumulate until they formed an unsplittable mass. He listened to Dr. Keene in a neutral voice, asked precise questions, and then, most importantly, arranged a face-to-face. The meeting took place in a small interrogation room at the precinct. Dr. Keene sat on a sticky chair and handed over a clean packet of printouts. The ledger, the voice memo transcript, the series of payments, the timestamps. Detective Rios looked over them without expression, then leaned forward and said, "This is more than a private affair. If this is what it looks like, it will be bigger than you think. You understand that implicates people with access and money." "That's why I called you," Dr. Keene replied. I didn't want to let a woman be cleaned out of her evidence by people with resources." Rios's eyes flicked up. "Do you know this woman?" "No," Dr. Keene said. "I know a patient being treated by me, and the records in the system suggest manipulation. I can't ignore it." Rios folded his hands. "We need chain of custody. We need proof that those records have been altered intentionally and who ordered the changes. It won't be easy." He was right, of course. Police work is not the raw romance of movie shows. It is document requests, subpoenas, depositions. It is a patience not commonly rewarded by the public. But Rios cared only for the arithmetic of facts. He also had the authority to issue preliminary subpoenas, to place holds on files, to freeze data. He could protect evidence from being cleaned again. Rios agreed to open a preliminary inquiry. The city prosecutor's office would need to be briefed if the trail suggested criminality. He asked Dr. Keene whether he could preserve copies of the files and whether he had any other records to provide. Dr. Keene handed him everything and felt a rush of relief that was not simple. Relief shaded with the knowledge that someone now had the thread and that thread could be pulled. When the word spread, quietly, in the small channels that gossip uses for professional ends, Marcus felt the first tremor of panic. A subpoena arriving at the door is like a cold hand in a summer pocket. It belongs somewhere else in the world of consequence. In the days after the detective's inquiry, someone in Marcus's circle began to whisper of escalating legal exposure. Conferences were called. Richard Hale made a number of discreet, urgent calls. The family table for discussions shrank to a small room where phrases like containment strategy and settlement viability were used in the same breath as reputation. Marcus's pulse rose when he learned that a detective had been asking questions. He began to pace in the apartment he had just furnished with Elena, going from room to room as if distance could make his problem smaller. He rang Elena, and she met him at the door in a silk dress as if she were a person who had nothing to fear. "Everything under control," she said, smiling, but her fingers were tight around the strap of her bag. She had the look of someone being slowly drained. "What did you tell them?" he demanded. She put a hand to his chest, small and steady. "I told them the legal team will manage it." He heard, in that compliance language, the edge of something that meant he could no longer sculpt the world with a curve of his jaw. The call with Detective Rios had the effect of a small hand that had unmoored the ego that had been easy to manipulate. Panicked, he went public with an op-ed that reframed him as a victim of smear campaigns, of a horde of public vultures. He arranged for a photo with his father in the new study of the house, and he wrote a message to his followers about compassion. On the web, people rallied and castigated in equal measure. The cascade of support was a brittle thing. It held for the cameras, but not under the weight of subpoenas. Nora, who had tried to sleep but had failed for weeks, watched the maneuvering and felt something wash over her that was not clean victory. She thought of lawyers she did not know, of courtrooms with fluorescent lights that flattened personalities into statements, of her child being collateral in a war of documents. She did not trust the legal system to make moral judgments. She trusted, painfully, her own capacity to protect the baby she carried. Between clinic appointments, between calls with her sister and small exhausted hours of sleep, she answered a message from an unknown number. The text read, "There are files that might help you. Meet me at Marlow Park bench afternoon. Come alone." Nora considered ignoring it. People used anonymous messages for cruel pranks, yet the voice inside her that had become a new kind of maternal calculation told her that when the scaffolding cracks, sometimes help arrives from strange people. She went to the park, the small shoe in her bag like a talisman, and sat on a bench where pigeons hopped and a fountain offered the sound of water to mute the city's noise. The woman who sat across from her wore a coat too large for the season and had the kind of hands that looked like they did work people didn't often see. She introduced herself as Maris. "I used to work in records," she said. "For a vendor. I saw things. I couldn't keep quiet." Nora listened without moving, as if not to startle the information into flight. "There's a ledger," Maris said. "A few lines, a few names. I made copies. I wasn't brave enough to go further, but I thought you should know." Maris slid a thin envelope across the bench. Nora's fingers closed on it and felt the small weight of reality in paper. Inside were photocopies, an expense sheet, a scanned voice memo transcription that matched details Dr. Keene had thought he alone held, and a line item that unfurled like an ugly ribbon. Archive services, Hale Solutions, $10,000 adjustments. The copies were cropped. Someone somewhere had gone to the trouble of making these partial and perhaps cautious prints. But the presence of Nora's name in a memo, carefully redacted to avoid a full identity, was enough to make the hair on the back of Nora's neck rise. "Why tell me?" she asked. "I couldn't look at it and do nothing," Maris answered. "When you know what people will do to other people's lives, silence starts to feel like a decision." Nora stood up with the envelope at her waist. She had, at the beginning of this story, imagined herself as a woman who would be protected by love. She had not imagined becoming an investigator of her own life. Now, with paper in hand that suggested the small shoe might be used as evidence to erase her, she felt an unfamiliar. Nora folded the photocopies into the same drawer that held the single leather shoe, as if both could be kept safe in a place that made sense. The envelope from Maris smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. The photocopies inside rattled when she moved, a small brittle music of proof. For the first time since Marcus's announcement, the anger inside her shifted toward focus. It was not the reckless revenge of a woman betrayed. It was calculation, a maternal geometry. Protect the child, protect the evidence, make sure no one else could make decisions about her life in a language of invoices and timestamps. She texted Lena, "I have something. Can you come now?" Lena arrived with a calm that looked like armor, sensible shoes, a legal pad. A look that said she would not be distracted by spectacle. Nora laid the photocopies out on the kitchen table like offerings. Lena read fast, her eyes moving with the speed of someone trained to extract leverage. "This is good," she said. "Not perfect, but good. We need a detective, someone who'll actually move before a PR team buries it." She paused, then looked at Nora. "You want me to call Rios?" It was a relief, in the sharp, flat way that comes when someone else says the word you have been thinking. They did call Detective Rios. They told him what they had and where they had found it. He listened, as he always did, for the exact lines that would make a case plausible: pattern, motive, access. When Nora heard his voice on the phone, cool and precise, she felt the first real lift of hope. Detective Rios suggested a cautious plan. He would ask the prosecutor to issue an immediate preservation order on the clinic's records, freeze the account trails, and begin a quiet subpoena to the third-party vendors. He asked Nora to provide a written statement to confirm dates and names. He asked Dr. Keene discreetly for the metadata he'd flagged. Rios spoke of chain of custody, how evidence must be packaged and logged, how one false move could let the other side argue contamination. The words were bureaucratic, and yet, in their particularity, fierce with protection. Nora gave her statement in a tiny room at the precinct. She spoke of the shoe on the table, of social media photos, of the way a man she had trusted had announced a life they had once planned together. She did not sob in front of the officer. She kept her voice even because she felt that evenness as a shield. When she left, Lena folded her arm through hers and squeezed. "We're going to make them work for every inch," Lena said. "We won't let them erase you." The police work moved like a slow machine with gears that could crush reputations and people alike. Subpoenas were issued to the clinic's IT vendor, to Hale Solutions, to the accounting firm listed on the invoices. Forensic analysts from the city lab extracted server logs, cloned drives, and produced printouts of metadata that described who had accessed what, when. The logs showed user IDs, IP addresses, times of edits, and crucially, a pattern of changes clustered in the hours after Marcus's public announcement. Each edited timestamp had an adjacent entry, a small payment, routed to a vendor with ties to the Hales. When the investigators confronted Marcus with the invoices, he tried to maintain composure. He denied knowledge of specific transfers, insisted any payments were for legitimate services, and smiled for the television cameras as if the smile itself could shape a judge's perception. But legal questions have a way of pruning a public face. A line item that had been buried in a general ledger could not clap back at a subpoena. Money makes stories pliable until legal paper proves otherwise. Dr. Keene moved through this with a peculiar, quiet ferocity. He had given the detective copies of the files he had printed late at night. For him, the decision had been a moral emergency, a time when the laws of the clinic were inadequate to the scale of the wrong he believed he had found. He understood, in ways that alarmed him, that lines he had once thought absolute, between patient confidentiality and public protection, had bent. He still feared the consequences for himself. A suspension for making extra copies, accusations of breaching patient trust. He tried to prepare for them, arranging his notes, cataloguing every step he had taken. If he was going to stand in a courtroom and say the truth, he wanted no ambiguity about his process. He also felt, with a slow but definite clarity, that his reasons for persevering had shifted. It was not only the patient file or the ledger. He had started staying late at the clinic, checking on Elena in ways that had nothing to do with prescription renewals. He found reasons to cross her path. A follow-up for a migraine, an offer of coffee in the staff lounge. The quiet times between appointments, the soft light of the clinic corridors, the small talk about diet and the weather, had become for him the most dangerous. He found that when she laughed, even the lines about procedures softened. When she spoke about fear, he wanted to make her safe, not just as a patient, but as a person. For her part, Elena was raw with conflicting loyalties. The Hales had promised her a life that eradicated the precarious edges she'd known. She had taken the promises not because she believed in their goodness, but because for a long time she had believed scarcity would be her chief enemy. But as the subpoena cloud loomed, the promises began to feel like bindings. Her parents, people she had not bothered to consult during her swift escalation into the public eye called with confusion and admonitions. Marcus called with increasingly clipped tones. The first time Elena saw him truly afraid, she felt a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. When Detective Rios came by the clinic to speak with Dr. Keene in person, it was because he wanted to understand motive more than method. He sat across from Dr. Keene, his hands folded, and asked the question that probably mattered most. What do you want to happen here? Dr. Keene, who had not yet admitted the emotional truth to himself, answered with professional clarity first. I want the records secured. I want the truth to come out. Then, after a hesitation that felt like a mechanical slip, he added, and I want, and stopped, as if the rest of the thought had no place in a police interview. He did not say the better part, that he wanted the woman he had come to protect to be seen as whole, not as a prop in a family narrative. Rios, careful and unreadable, filed that part away as irrelevant to the investigation. He pressed instead on the chain of access. Who could have ordered these changes? He asked. We found entries on the server from a user connected to Hale Solutions, Dr. Keene said. But access can be obfuscated. The logs show remote access points. The invoices show payments. It's circumstantial until IT correlates IP addresses to physical machines. Rios nodded. We will need corroboration. We will need to show intent. And we will need witnesses. Does anyone in the clinic know about the payments? No, Dr. Keene said. If they did, they'd have told me. The administrative team is loyal for reasons I don't fully understand. But there are people outside the clinic, vendors who might talk if subpoenaed. Rios's face softened, only minutely. We'll do it carefully. If we move fast, we can preserve the data. If we move slow, you risk an institutional cleanup. Meanwhile, the Hales did not sit idly. Richard Hale assembled a small circle, lawyers, accountants, and a crisis manager known for smoothing reputations. They made offers to vendors and hinted at settlements. A hush settlement here, a quiet consultant contract there, small surgical interventions to buy plausible deniability. Richard's view of the world operated under the assumption that paper and money were sculptors of narrative. He had always believed that the truth was negotiable if you had enough influence. Marcus, however, began to fray in ways his father did not anticipate. The public found that faux moral essays about authenticity looked thin next to a criminal subpoena. Sponsors began to ask questions. A small advisory board to one of his ventures sent a terse email asking for clarity on his involvement with third-party contractors. The first domino fell with the softest sound. A partner who preferred not to be associated with legal uncertainty politely withdrew from an upcoming initiative. Under pressure, some people talk. Elena, who had spent nights rehearsing denials in front of a bedroom mirror, started to have other sorts of sleeplessness. The weight of her choices settled into a physical ache. One evening, after an inspection of her own file and then a secretive voicemail that made her feel cold and small, she went to Dr. Keene's office without warning. She found him packing up at the end of a long day. He looked at her with an expression that had ceased to be merely clinical. For both of them, the room contracted to focus only on what they might lose. I don't know what to do, Elena said, folding her hands in the way people fold them when they expect to be judged. You don't have to prove anything to me, Dr. Keene said. He kept his voice steady. But you need to be honest with yourself and with those who will ask the questions. She looked at him as if the truth was a pyre she might be forced to stand near. They told me to say what I needed to say. They promised they'd protect me. They said I would be taken care of. And now? He asked. And now, she said simply, I think they were protecting themselves. Her gaze dropped. I did things I regret. I'm terrified for what happens next. He wanted to reach across the desk and take her hand. He wanted, absurdly and irreparably, to be more than a clinician. He wanted to tell her that whatever the consequences, suspension, reputational fallout, he would be there. He imagined walking into a press room and saying it aloud. Yes, I violated a protocol to protect a truth. He could see the headline, and it was both terrifying and right. He did not say that. Instead, he asked a more measured question. Will you tell the truth if asked? She inhaled as if preparing to climb. If it means someone else won't be hurt, yes. If I'm asked to be honest in court, I'll tell what I know. That was all he needed for the moment. It was an oath of sorts, shaky and not yet legal, but it anchored him. The prosecutors moved with slow institutional authority. Subpoenas went out. Forensic teams extracted server images under warrants. The IT vendor, when confronted with the paper trail and the legal presentation, did not at first cooperate. Its corporate spokesperson spoke in defensive press statements about data privacy and vendor-client confidentiality. But under legal pressure, the vendor turned over logs that showed remote access from a set of IP addresses that could be traced to a suite rented by a consulting arm historically associated with the Hales. The chain of payments, the ledger entries, and metadata coalesced into a mosaic that pointed toward intentional manipulation. In the middle of this, Dr. Keene was notified that the clinic's board would hold an emergency session. He braced for censure. When the board convened, hushed voices filled the wood-paneled room. He presented his documentation. The original files he'd printed, the logs he'd catalogued, and his notes on the steps he'd taken. He told them, plainly, that he had retained copies because he feared evidence disappearing, that he had contacted law enforcement, and that he had done so because he believed the integrity of patient records had been compromised. The board's reaction was procedural but sharp. They could not ignore his actions. A hospital cannot function if any staff member feels free to remove files. At the same time, the board recognized that the allegations had vast public implications. They agreed to defer to the prosecutor's office and to place a temporary administrative hold on some clinical records access. He would face an internal inquiry for protocol deviation, one of the members said, but they would also cooperate with the investigation. The resolution fell like a complicated benediction, not exoneration, not condemnation. Dr. Keene left the meeting both vindicated in purpose and vulnerable to process. The decision to call Elena as a witness was a turning point. For her, it meant the choice to step into a public legal spotlight that had been carefully designed to preserve her image. Marcus, who had thought his public embrace of her sealed a new chapter of life, panicked privately when she agreed to meet with the investigators. He tried, furiously and unsuccessfully, to persuade her to maintain the script he'd paid for. Denial, and a cut-and-polish narrative of voluntary reinvention. On the day she was scheduled to be interviewed, Marcus arrived unannounced at the clinic. The elevator opened like a stage curtain, and he stepped out into a corridor where Dr. Keene happened to be walking with a file under his arm. The meeting in the hallway was a collision of private and public. "What are you doing with her file?" Marcus asked, forced calm cracking. "Nothing you don't have the right to ask through formal channels," Dr. Keene replied. Marcus's face grew hard. "You don't get to become judge and jury, doctor. Stay in your lane." "Staying in my lane meant keeping honest records," Dr. Keene said. "That's what I did. If you're worried about what the records say, maybe you should be worried about why they needed changing." Marcus reached the end of whatever restraint he had and slapped the file from Keene's hands. It was a gesture that rippled with the old entitlement. When power bruises someone, it thinks force will correct facts. The file fluttered to the floor. People stopped and turned. "You will regret this," Marcus hissed. He met Dr. Keene's eyes, and, in those eyes, for the first time, there was something he recognized not as challenge, but as a force he could not order around. The camera phones in the hallway, staffers with a nervous sense of drama, caught the moment, and within minutes, the clip of Marcus shoving at a doctor was circulating. A small scandal within the larger scandal. Marcus's standing did not survive the accumulation of these moments. The press, hungry for texture, marveled at the tableau. The philanthropist who had left his pregnant wife now shoving a doctor near an ultrasound suite. Social media, always eager to place its verdicts, variously branded him a villain, a hypocrite, and a bully. Sponsors and partners, nervous about association, started to distance themselves. One by one, board members of his ventures excused themselves from public duties. The bubble of status that had once shielded him began to deflate. The courtroom, when it came, had a special kind of gravity. Prosecutors had decided to bring charges: fraudulent alteration of records, conspiracy to commit tampering, and related offenses that fit the pattern investigators had uncovered. The case was not a slam dunk of dramatic courtroom theatrics. It was a careful reheating of timelines, the presentation of forensic logs, and witness testimony that connected money, motive, and action. On the first day of the hearing, the gallery was full. Cameras lined the hallways. The Hales were a presence. Richard sophisticated and stone-faced, Marcus pinched and smaller than his curated photos suggested. Nora sat with Lena and her midwife Priya, who had come to offer support but not testify. The city prosecutor presented the evidence methodically. The metadata printouts showing the edits, the ledger entries that traced payments to vendors tied to Hale Solutions, and the voice memo transcribed with a phrase that seemed to sever artifice. Move the file and make it clean. When Dr. Keene was called to the stand, his hands were steady. He described, in clinical language given a human texture by the stakes, the discrepancies he had found. He explained the habit of medical documentation and what it meant when an entry did not fit the expected flow. He testified to seeing edits made under a user ID that had no business in clinical archives. He explained the steps he'd taken to preserve copies and why he had decided to bring the matter to law enforcement rather than allow compliance procedures to alone take effect. On cross-examination, the defense honed in on his decision to retain copies. "Doctor," the defense attorney intoned, "you admit you copied these records without authorization?" "I did," Dr. Keene replied. "I did because I feared the evidence would be altered or disappear." "Isn't that a breach of patient confidentiality?" the attorney pressed. "It is," he said, "and I'm prepared to accept the consequences, but I believed the greater harm would be to allow records to be altered to the detriment of an innocent party." The room hummed. He had acknowledged fault and yet turned it into a moral act. The prosecution had asked him to be honest, and he had been. Then came Elena's testimony. She spoke with a voice that trembled with the weight of choices. She admitted to accepting assistance, to allowing narratives to be crafted. She named Marcus's involvement in instructing staff to stress the narrative, a phrase that prosecutors had been careful to place in context. She told the court, bluntly, that she had been afraid of the consequences of walking away from the life offered to her. Financial insecurity, social collapse, the way the world can swallow a young woman with few advantages. She also told the court that the changes made to her records had been requested by people who implied protection would follow compliance. Eleanor's testimony was not exculpatory for her. It was a complex admission of complicity and coercion. The jury listened, and the way people reacted in the gallery, the mix of pity and judgment, said as much about public appetites as the facts themselves. The turning point came when the IT forensic analyst took the stand. He described the chain of access, the IP addresses, the times, the user IDs. He demonstrated how the edits clustered in the hours after Marcus's public announcement, how payments corresponded to times when the archival vendor pushed batches labeled reconstruction. He explained patiently that the artifacts in the server logs could not be explained as accidental clerical errors. He showed on a screen the correlation between money, access, and outcome. All of this was heavy institutional work. It was not cinematic in the way a film summarizes. It was slow, legal, and precise. But for the public, it felt like a revelation. The machinery of influence could be traced if you had the will and the legal tools to follow it. Marcus watched as the narrative he had hoped to keep contained unraveled. His attempts at charm evaporated under the light of evidence. On the second day of testimony, during a break in proceedings, a photographer's lens caught him at a hallway outside the courthouse. He spoke loudly into his phone, his voice theatrical and unguarded. "They can't do this," he said. "This is a smear. We'll fight. We'll sue." Then his voice hit a panic that sounded like a thin animal noise. He had not expected his life to be stripped so publicly, and the thing he feared more than legal penalty was the personal, the loss of control, the exposure that bled into human judgment. Public pressure intensified. Board members resigned. A city councilwoman who had once accepted donations from the Hales returned her contributions and issued a statement about ethical giving. The cumulative effect was a cascade of losses. Partnerships dissolved, contracts terminated, and, perhaps most devastating to Marcus's psyche, the social circles that had once lavished him with approval began to look away. In the middle of this, Nora navigated her own private terrain. The legal battle did not erase the physical reality of carrying a child to term. Her veterinary calm in giving statements and preparing testimony was undergirded by nightly fears that did not involve reputation so much as oxygen and heartbeat. She continued prenatal visits, measured fetal movement with a meticulousness that had nothing to do with court dates. Lena managed the press with a blunt force that made the media's appetite ebb and redirected it toward the legal facts rather than Nora's personhood. When the prosecution rested, the defense attempted to drive wedges, question the chain of custody, challenge witnesses' motives, point to the ambiguous language of vendor invoices. But the pile of documents, the corroborated logs, and Elena's reluctant, honest testimony formed a mass that was difficult to dismantle. The jury deliberated for a day. When the verdict came, it did not read like a cliffhanger. Marcus was found guilty on counts related to record tampering and conspiracy to commit tampering. The court sentenced him to a period that commentators debated, neither a martyr's redemption nor ruinous imprisonment, but enough to ensure that his public life, as it had once been, could not simply resume. There would be appeals, they all acknowledged, but for Nora, the immediate consequence mattered less than the moral one. The man who had walked out on her to stage a life had been publicly found to have manipulated the very machinery that might have been used to strip her of rights. The fall was not merely legal. At a press conference, a correspondent asked Marcus a question that cut to the personal. Did you ever think about how your actions would affect the child? For a moment he looked like a man who had never made this personal calculation. He barked then, in a way that made bystanders flinch. This is about privacy, he said. This is about... And then, in a primal fracture, he lost the aura of composure. He wept in the microphones, an incongruous, humiliating, most human sound. To some it was a performative end. To others, it was the collapse of a man who had expected his wealth to inoculate him from consequence. Nora watched him and felt the last physical edges of her anger recede into a softer space. The victory was not a gloatable thing. The court's decision did not, could not, repair all the broken trust and the months of anxiety. It did, however, provide a public recognition that the scales had been tipped unfairly against her. In that public reckoning, she found a way to breathe that was less constricted. Eleanor's trajectory after testifying was quieter and less predictable. She entered a program of counseling and made an agreement with prosecutors to cooperate in exchange for leniency. She faced public scorn and eventually a kind of private rebuilding. She had cost herself a different life than the one she'd imagined, one with Marcus salons and charity galas, and she had to live in the residue. She accepted that the way she had survived had also harmed others. She volunteered at a support organization for young women when the cameras were not there. She wrote, privately, letters to Nora, not to ask for forgiveness, but to explain the shapes of fear that had driven her. Dr. Keene's life changed as well. The board's internal review concluded that while he had erred procedure-wise by retaining copies of records, his action had been motivated by a reasonable fear of evidence destruction. He received an administrative reprimand and a temporary restriction on certain types of access, while the clinic overhauled its record preservation processes. The public opinion that had for a time painted him as a rogue physician shifted to something more ambivalent, a man who had acted imperfectly yet courageously. The medical board issued guidance about whistleblower protections in clinical settings, and the clinic implemented new policies about secure audits. His relationship with Elena remained complicated and, by design, slow. They met once in a public cafe that smelled of coffee and the kind of scrubbed normalcy that makes people feel temporarily absolved. They spoke honestly. He did not and would not make grand rom-com promises. He offered to be present in a way that respected her autonomy. She, in turn, told him she needed time and therapy and a life not defined by her mistakes. There were small gestures, a note after a difficult hearing, a text when she returned from a counseling session. Love, in their case, was not a decisive blow, but a persistent, careful tending of two people who had both been bewildered by power. Nora's final trimester slid toward an odd kind of stillness. The press cycles turned to other stories. Human appetites are ravenous and soon have room for a new drama. In the quiet, she planned a birth that would be about the baby and not about the spectacle. Lena organized the birthing plan with a gentle insistence that left room for emotion but cut sharp edges of control. Priya, the midwife, suggested a small circle of supportive people in the delivery room. Nora wanted this child to be loved openly, not managed like another object in a public campaign. On a rain-soft night, in a hospital that smelled of antiseptic and coffee, Nora went into labor. Marcus was not there. He had been given a suspended sentence. The court allowed no immediate contact that might be construed as interference. Her labor was long and full of small miracles, fetal heart monitors that sang steady, the midwife's calm voice, Lena holding her hand and making jokes about names. Dr. Keene did not attend. Ethical considerations and the delicate public dynamics made that impossible. He did, however, send a single bouquet of white lilies with a card that read, simply, "For the new life you brought us all back to. With respect, A.K." When the baby came, small and loud and startlingly perfect, Nora felt something inside her loosen and make space. The infant screamed and then, after a few minutes, let out the tiny, stunned silence of a creature finding air. They put the baby on her chest. The room blurred. Lena cried because she could not help it. Priya said, in the softest voice, "You did well." They brought the shoe, the little leather shoe that had been on the dining table, into the room and placed it by the bassinet like a talisman that had been reclaimed. Nora looked at the tiny foot, at the hair that lay like a dark moon, and thought of all the ways life and power and shame had tangled. She thought of Marcus and the man he had been when he decided his truth mattered more than her body. She thought of Elena and Dr. Keene and Detective Rios and Maris in the park and all the small stubborn acts that had refused erasure. The aftermath was not cinematic restitution. There were no tidy pardons or coronations. The Hales retreated, their name diminished in committees and boardrooms. Richard Hale, who had spent a life arranging reputations like floral displays, found his network narrowed. People he had once presumed to be friends smiled politely at charity events and did not answer calls. The family, once monolithic, now had cracks that would not easily be glued. Marcus spent months in penumbra, legal appeals, financial strain, the hollowing silence of friends who had once called too often. He lost board positions and a sense of entitlement that had been his inheritance. When the court finally pronounced sentence, the cameras recorded a man small and disoriented, no longer a polished spokesman, but a person reaping the costs of choices that had been long ago made. Nora, for her part, did not seize vengeance. She made careful decisions about custody and privacy. She signed agreements that protected the baby from public exploitation and established a trust that would manage finances so the child's upbringing would not be fettered by the chaos of the past. She pursued legal redress that was protective, not punitive. She wanted the baby to have a life in which the parents' mistakes did not define them. In private moments that autumn, Dr. Keene visited the clinic less often. When he did, he walked with a humility that had not been there before, his hands less sure but his purpose steadier. He continued his practice with a new caution that was not cowardice but a refined sense of responsibility. Eleanor's recovery included volunteer work and therapy, and she occasionally visited the small support group meetings that Nora's sister helped coordinate for women dealing with public trauma. Their connections were not tidy romances spun into perfect closures. If the world wanted a neat love story, Doctor saves a mistress, they ride off into sunlit redemption. Life refused such clarity. The doctor's love remained present and human, imperfect, costly, and open to consequences. Eleanor and he took slow steps, coffee dates that never became declarations, long phone calls that ended without promises. They learned to be present without making vows too quickly. The final public act that summed the arc was surprisingly small. At a civic forum about privacy and health records, Detective Rios, now a figure of lean competence, moderated a panel where Dr. Keene spoke about the need for secure audits and patient protections. The clinic had revamped its procedures. The city council drafted legislation that tightened vendor oversight. Eleanor, who had been invited to speak about coercion and survival, declined at the last minute and sent a letter read aloud by a moderator. Nora, who had not wanted to be a spokesperson for policy, attended in the audience, the baby now a chubby, watchful toddler in the arms of a nanny who wore sensible shoes. When the moderator finished reading Elena's letter, the room applauded, not for the trials they had undergone, but for the work ahead. The applause felt like a hinge being turned, not a conclusion, but an opening. Nora's life after the trial was not defined by headlines. She went back to the rhythms that make up ordinary courage: midnight feedings, pediatrician visits, the small solid acts of parenting. She enrolled in a course on child development because she liked learning things she could use. She reconnected with friends who had stayed like island beacons during the storm. One afternoon, months after the verdict, she walked in a park with the baby in a sling. She saw Maris on a bench and paused. Their eyes met. Maris stood and came over. They did not need many words. "I did what I could," Maris said. Nora put her hand on Maris's arm. "So did you," she replied. The final image, the one that lingered, was modest. Nora, holding the baby, sunlight painting the stroller's rim, a small leather shoe dangled from a keychain Lena had made for the child. It was not a symbol of revenge, but of reclamation. A tiny object converted from accusation to an artifact of survival. Justice had been partial and procedural, as justice often is. There were settlements and appeals, probes that tightened vendor oversight, a few lawsuits that rattled some reputations further. People who had been complicit paid various prices, some public, some quiet. Lives rearranged themselves into new configurations, none of them exactly what anyone had predicted. For Nora, the arc closed not on spectacle but on a quieter power. She had been abandoned, humiliated, and nearly erased. She had fought not because she loved litigation but because she loved her unborn child, and because she refused to let narrative dictate her future. The man who had left her had lost much: position, pride, and the easy access to other people's stories. The mistress had been humanized through cost and consequence. The doctor had fallen into love in a way that made him braver and more vulnerable. All of them paid fees: legal, emotional, reputational. As she watched her child sleep in the soft light of the nursery, Nora thought of the first morning, the empty dining room with a single shoe laid like an accusation. That shoe now hung on a small hook near the crib, a memento that had been refitted into a guardian. She whispered the baby's name, simple and new, and felt at last a peace that was not triumphal but real. If this story left you stunned, subscribe to follow more true-to-drama stories like this one.